Hello, Dr. Bell, Dr. Park, Dr. Chihak, and Dr. Dunn. I'm very excited to be working with you guys as my dissertation committee beginning later this month. Dr. Bell is about to send out to you, or perhaps already has, my outline that I've been preparing over the last couple months in terms of my dissertation plan. Basically, during this semester, I've been working with Dr. Bell in a supervised readings capacity and have been working my way through um, the literature in regards to teacher education and to the specific location where my study will be fitting into that context. And it's been a great experience for me. I'm very thankful for AERA and all the work that they've done in consolidating research regarding teacher education over the generations that has been taking place. So I want to kind of prime you a little bit on what I'm planning to do with the dissertation and that the notes that you have received or will receive so that you're not totally cold turkey when you get this for the first time. Um, so basically, what I'm exploring here is a group study design in which I'm trying to see the extent to which faculty modeling of the principles of universal design for learning impacts the degree to which students in special education 402 know, understand, and apply these principles. And in so doing, I've approached this in a fairly broad theoretical, philosophical perspective. Um, my research in through the AERA handbooks and so forth has basically given me a perspective of how teacher education has evolved over the decades since it became a recognized field of study back in about the 50s. And so what you'll see me doing in those notes in the first few pages is a very broad framing of these where I'm trying to understand with those diagrams on page 2 the nature of research in teacher education as a response to microsystematic functions of society, such as economics and politics and social circumstances. I feel like these things, directly or indirectly, push for new lines of research in teacher education, which of course does not simply come out of a vacuum. And so when we do research in teacher education, is what I'm arguing, our research, because in recognizing that it does not come out of a vacuum, has to be done in such a way that we think about where does this line of research come from, because that is the place where this research is ultimately going back to serve. So, for example, I feel that the teacher education research should be at its heart very practical. It's talking about how do we actually equip and prepare teachers who are better able to serve the schools, students, and communities for which they are change makers. So that's basically what I'm doing there. I'm looking through the history of teacher education. What I've come to find and experience is that there's essentially three major eras, if you will, of teacher education where we've moved through from a sort of behaviorist paradigm back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and into the 80s a bit. And this really, the way that Cochrane Smith defines it in the AERA handbook, is a period in which the problem of teacher education was about um, teacher training. So, or basically, um, how do we equip teachers to be able to do the right things in the classroom? And I feel like the classroom back in the 50s, 60s, 70s was a lot more homogenous than it is now, a principle that is very well articulated in current literature. And I think it was that very shifting nature of the classrooms going into the 70s and 80s, when it really began in earnest, I think, that led to the emergence of, or has contributed to, I should say, the emergence of a more cognitive approach to teacher education. And the way Cochrane Smith frames that is that the problem of teacher education then became a problem of learning. You know, how do we help teachers learn to teach? How do we shape the right attitudes and beliefs such that teachers go on learning even after they have left college? Now, both of these, of course, have significant strengths and weaknesses. where behaviorism is extremely useful in giving teachers hands-on strategies and skills for what to do. The problem is that the complexity of classrooms yesterday and today are uh, too much for static strategies, and it just isn't enough for teachers to have those skills without a broader framework for where those skills are coming from and how to adopt them and how to come up with new strategies. And so the cognitive paradigm was effective in recognizing that and in essentially trying to address that. However, what we're beginning to see is that oftentimes students who have come up through cognitive only paradigms and teacher education programs might really have a very strong sense of beliefs and attitudes and perspectives related to how to teach and why to teach and so on and so forth, and yet they don't necessarily know what to do. So, for example, students who have gone through such programs might really believe that students with disabilities, students with linguistic differences, and so on and so forth, really need to be taught in the mainstream classroom, deserve to learn with everybody else, and so on and so forth. And then you put them in a class with 25 students, 4 of which have disabilities, and they don't know what to do. From this, I feel like we've moved into a time in which we've seen the strengths of behaviorism, we've seen the strengths of cognitivism, and we've also come to recognize their limitations. In this post-positivist period, we no longer have to say which one of these two is right. We're now able to say, and I would argue should be saying, what about these is right, and how can we draw out that which is good in each of these major paradigms and formulate something new that's hybridized from these perspectives. And that's where, of course, the cognitive behaviorist perspective has come in. And I think that in terms of the history of teacher education, this is really where we are. If we're hoping to advance the field of teacher education, I would argue that such advancement requires drawing from both behaviorism and cognitivism. Now, Cochran-Smith doesn't end with cognitivism. She suggests, and I think accurately, that as we move into the 21st century with things like No Child Left Behind Act and others like um, Race to the Top and so forth, we've really moved into an accountability period, a policy period. And so, according to her, the 2000s forward marks an era of what she calls a policy problem in teacher education. This is an interesting shift where we really were dealing with a fairly theoretical basis with behaviorism and cognitivism. With the policy period, it's not so much a theoretical perspective as much as it is a call for more of a scientific basis for education, more of a accountability in education, which is no bad thing. Yet it doesn't really necessarily add any approaches per se to how we would go about researching, which is why I'm falling back on the behavioral cognitive as the two major paradigms of teacher education hitherto. Okay, so let me look at my notes here. So that's kind of where I'm going with the broad framing. Once I've established what those perspectives are and where we are in teacher education, I really want to dig a little bit deeper into what this all means for any research that's being done here and now. And so I explore some of the implications of using the cognitive behaviorist approach in terms of, for example, how we go about teaching teachers in both cognitive and behaviorist methodologies, and if we're going to research that, how we go about researching when we're trying to simultaneously address students' knowledge, attitudes, beliefs, skills, all of that is such a complex meta-construct that we need complex methodology in order to explore those topics. So I kind of address some of that in there. One of the issues that you might notice some bar graphs going into about page 9 or 10 there, there's some bar graphs. Those are taken from a self-study that I did with my own teaching of SPED 402 this last semester. One of the questions that comes up on the literature is that of whether it's possible for teacher educators to meaningfully adjust or modify the knowledge, sorry, the beliefs and attitudes that pre-service teachers have when they come into the program. It's been hypothesized and suggested that it is very difficult, if not impossible, to change attitudes and beliefs of pre-service teachers. Now, I don't think that's true. Some of the literature that has said that, I've come to the belief that they're throwing the baby out with the bathwater, that maybe it's not the fact that these students cannot change their perspectives or beliefs, or it's not that our programs can't help them adjust their perspectives, beliefs, and attitudes, but that the methods that were used to modify their beliefs and attitudes were ineffective. And so we can't just jump to the conclusion that it's not possible, as the way that some authors have in so far. What I'm suggesting then from a theoretical basis is that when we experience things, it has a much stronger capability to change our knowledge and beliefs than when we're simply told about something. Inasmuch as my research is focused on modeling best practices, modeling UDL, as it were, to my students and actively reflecting on it. This is a very deeply experiential process where these students are not just being told about the benefits of UDL. I'm actively and intentionally recognizing that the students in my class are diverse individuals and using that knowledge to shape the way that I teach, shape the way that I interact with them, shape the way that they are able to respond to me, and connecting this to UDL and helping them to actively think about what I'm doing, how it relates to the content that we're learning about, and what it means for their future classrooms. My theoretical belief is that intensive personal experience has a tremendous amount of social power to change their attitudes and beliefs in a way that traditional lecture formats, for example, those that might have been being used in previous decades when some of this literature came out, are not. So those bar graphs that I mentioned are just preliminary. I'm just testing out this idea in 402, where I used a very much a similar approach to what I'm proposing for my dissertation in that class this semester. And at the end of the course, I gave them a survey, four of the questions of which are here posted in the bar graphs. As you might be able to see, there are before and after questions dealing with before this class, I believe the students with disabilities ought to be in the mainstream classroom, and after. And it goes from a very wide spread from 1 to 5 on a Likert scale, with 5 being strongly agree, before, to a very, very strong shift to the right after. Likewise, I asked them in a separate question before this class I felt confident I could teach such students, and it was almost a perfectly even distribution, skewed a little bit to the left before, and very strongly all answers were either a 4 or 5 after, which just begins to indicate that there was some power to this methodology, and that the students, whether or not they are actually better equipped, this obviously doesn't tell me, but what it does show is that they think that they are. That their attitudes and their beliefs and their self-efficacy have grown as a result of being in this course in the way that it was taught, which begins to indicate some potential success for the study. From there, basically, it's sort of a rift here in my logic. So not my logic, but in my framing. Up to here has really been the very broad framework. Where are we in the history of teacher education research? Where does this research fit? At this point, I zoom in a little bit more and look at where are we right now, and establishing the need for some change in how we go about teacher education. What I'm demonstrating through the literature is essentially the degree to which the diversity of our students is now greater than it has ever have been before, and that diversity is only increasing. At the same time, our teacher population is maintaining quite constant, quite homogeneous, with the vast majority of our teachers being white, middle class, and female. And while that's not necessarily a bad thing, what is becoming apparent is that we're experiencing a greater and greater and greater rift between who is teaching and who is being taught. Inasmuch as that is true, it becomes increasingly necessary for us to equip all of our teachers to know how to work with diverse populations that are not their own populations. And so that's a big part of it. We also see in the literature that that's not that's something that does explicitly need to happen, because even as in more recent times we've seen a shift in young people where, for example, today being inclusive minded, being accepting of differences is the popular paradigm, perhaps, where maybe 40 years ago segregation was more of a popular paradigm. That's a good thing. However, even so, oftentimes what the literature is showing is that those who are uh, white, middle class, and so forth are the ones who are least likely or willing or happy to actively discuss differences. We've seen a lot of shifting towards things like, for example, colorblindness. And in so doing, those who are in the most dominant groups, essentially, inadvertently are contributing to their own dominance, to the and thus to the oppression of the other groups. By not recognizing differences, teachers cannot adapt to those differences. As such, I feel it's very important in teacher education that we are explicitly helping our students learn how to think about, how to talk about, how to recognize the diversity that's in their classrooms. Because if they do not actively recognize that diversity, there's no way that they will be ready to teach to that diversity. This reflects some work that's been done by, for example, Bandura all the way back in '82, positing that of course um, teacher actions are mediated by their beliefs. If they don't believe what they believe, will strongly influence the way that they teach. So all of that basically brings us to a point where I'm arguing that uh, when we teach teachers, it has to be from an approach that helps develop their knowledge and beliefs and attitudes, especially when it comes to diversity and special education. And then at the same time, we must follow up with, what do you actually do? How can you actively, realistically meet the diverse needs of a highly diverse population like you're going to expect in your future classroom? So, in so doing, we're really bringing together these ideas where I'm down with a two-timed approach, if you're following along in the outline. Um, so really we're bringing together here the idea of content and pedagogy, and where traditionally we have seen these two as separate constructs in the literature, what I think makes most sense for what I'm doing here is to make a meta construct that is both about pedagogy and uh, content. I feel this be because of two reasons. First of all, because the pedagogy, how we teach and stuff. Let me try that again. I feel this is true for the main reason is because we have this hybrid paradigm of cognitive behaviorism, which reflects both um, the concepts and strategies and skills and beliefs, and then also the actions. And so we need to make sure that we're incorporating both of those. But the other thing is that in teacher education, this might be the only discipline in the world in which pedagogy is our content. There's a great quote by Bloom back in 1973 who said that teachers teach as they are taught, not as they are taught to teach. And as much as this is true, therefore, it's of critical importance that we are very cognizant of both our content and our pedagogy. And I feel that not just what we teach, but how we teach what we're teaching will be significant in determining if what we're teaching is effective and if our teachers actually take it and put it into practice. And so in this sense, it doesn't make sense to parse it completely into content and pedagogy, and that's why I'm suggesting a hybrid variable. This brings me essentially down to then what will be the pedagogy and what will be the content and how will they work together. And so that's where I get into faculty modeling and universal design for learning. I'm projecting faculty modeling as the main um, pedagogical strategy that's being used here, where essentially throughout the course, I will not only be teaching about UDL, but at the same time teaching with UDL and explicitly guiding the students in reflection on that. I've already done a tremendous amount of review literature review on the topic of faculty modeling. That's linked in this document. I didn't go into detail about it because I have a whole paper written about it. So you can follow that link and read that whole paper if you'd like to. You really don't need to read the whole thing. But the point is that I've extensively studied faculty modeling and its different manifestations and its representation in the literature. From there, I will switch to the content itself. Universal Design for Learning, I think most, if not all of you, are familiar with this, but it has been gaining tremendous momentum in state and federal legislation and in research and in practice. It is really a booming domain in literature, in the literature for education. Um, Basically, Universal Design for Learning is a framework. It's not necessarily, it's not content, it's not a strategy, it's a framework for teaching, and that gives it some of its universality, um, whereby teachers are using multiple means of representation, multiple means of student action and expression, multiple means of motivation and engagement, such that students can choose what works for them, how to express themselves, what to attend to in learning things, and it essentially is built on a recognition of that we can assume diversity. So where old paradigms assumed average and then adapted for those who were not average, now we know that there's a huge range of predictable variability in our classes, and so we want to ensure that the way we go into it, teaching in such a way that recognizes that of course our students are going to be different, of course they're going to learn in different ways, of course they need to express themselves in different ways. So in as much as Universal Design for Learning is becoming a focal point for states and federal government and a well-established researched practice, I feel like it is a central topic to cover in SPED 402, which makes it a natural content point for this study. Thus, my construct that's being used as the independent variable, essentially, is using the faculty modeling to teach UDL as a hybrid meta construct, and then comparing that to using traditional lecture format to teach UDL as a hybrid construct, and seeing to what extent students' knowledge, understanding, attitudes, beliefs, and skills as demonstrated in lesson planning are different from these two approaches. In terms of methodology, I'm just breaking into that now. To some extent, I've been working on it in other ways for a while. I'm basically looking at, because this is such a complex construct, it requires, like I mentioned before, a complex meta approach to, in terms of instruments and analysis. I have to basically be able to look at both what have the students learned and how have they changed in terms of attitudes and beliefs, while at the same time being ascertaining, do they have the requisite knowledge and skills to put these theoretically shifted beliefs and attitudes into actual practice. So I'm proposing 3 different instruments to be used for this study. The first will be what they're already doing at the end of the semester for this class, which is the Universally Designed Lesson Plan, UDLP. And so basically I'm intending to study this both quantitatively and qualitatively. I can use, for example, the UDL published framework to identify via checklist form how many of the different constructs of UDL the students are demonstrating in this UDLP. I can also do a qualitative analysis in which I explore the degree to which they are specific in their strategies, to the degree to which their strategies match the student class constellation that they articulated, and so forth. And again, compare those between the two classes. The second instrument will be a pre-post-test design knowledge and application inventory that I created as part of Dr. Morrow's class in classroom measurement. That is a fairly brief 20-question multiple choice test that was very carefully constructed under the auspices of Dr. Morrow to examine some complex knowledge of UDL and several application settings and how the students would respond from the UDL perspective. Again, that would be pre-test, post-test, as well as between the two classes. So my plan for that is to use a 2A ANOVA. I actually set up the analysis plan for that as part of statistics too, and so I have that as well. The third instrument that I'm proposing is one that I recently discovered, which is that of concept mapping. I have two articles that have dealt with this, one from 1998 and another from 2004, in which they've really done a fantastic job articulating exactly how to use this concept mapping for purposes strongly aligned to what I'm doing. For example, this paper by Trent in 1998 was focusing on this idea in a class of teaching culturally diverse learners, which of course is strongly related to what I'm doing. You see, they have essentially a pretest in which the students were given very specific instructions for how to use concept maps, how to create a concept map for this specific topic, which was a given. And the students just kind of branch off from that and articulate, write a couple paragraphs explaining themselves and what ideas and thoughts they have related to this. At the conclusion of the semester, they redo it, and this was the same student for both of these. You can see how the post-test essentially was far more complex. They have more specificity, they have more hierarchies, they have more connections, and the authors have created a specific way to score these, which gives a quantitative measure holistically for the graphs before and after for students and for the class, and also breaks it down into specific domains. For example, teacher knowledge, teacher actions, student actions, family qualities, whatever. And again, they can compare these in terms of how often and how in depth those were covered before and after. So they can look at the class growth as a whole, specific student growth individually, specific domain growth, and so forth. In fact, a second paper on the topic has actually even created an entire rubric which allows us to check to see for each student what they included in their maps before and after the class. And so this is nice because I can essentially use a lot of what they already have here and simply adapt it to specifically include disabilities as part of this particular course. Um, Ultimately, this also serves as a learning tool and one that might be one to permanently include in SPED Forward 2 because it allows the students after that second concept map to give them back the one that they did at the beginning of the semester, and they have an opportunity to reflect and write about how they've changed, how their understanding has grown. And that's a powerful reflection, I feel, for them as professionals, and also helps model the process of being reflective, again, as part of being a professional. So this again also lends itself to both quantitative and qualitative. I already talked about the scoring, but in the qualitative component, both the essays that they write with it or the paragraphs, and the choice of words and concepts and so forth they present here also allows for a qualitative exploration. So these two of my tools are mixed method, quantitative and qualitative, and I really feel like that's necessary for this cognitive behavioral approach. The third one is more purely knowledge and understanding based. And the reason that one is important, I think, is because, of course, without requisite knowledge and basic application strategies, and on paper, how could we possibly expect that the students would be able to know and practice these things in a real-world classroom? So, given the limitation of this study being that I'm doing it as a PhD student in a limited amount of time, I don't have the chance to follow these students at this time into their actual teaching practices. It's important for me to get as close as I can to seeing that they could apply these things. So between the UDLP and the knowledge and application inventory, it will give me some strong information to that end, and then adding in the concept mapping will also allow me to see their development and growth. And for all of these, I can compare them between the two different groups to see in a triangulated fashion which of the two methods was more effective. And of course, I'm hypothesizing that the faculty modeled methodology will be far more effective than the traditional lecture. So That's where I am. You can find more details, in the notes themselves. Of course, not everything that I've studied is in there, but it gives kind of a broad perspective of where I'm coming from, what my plan is. I hope that this kind of helps clarify for you where I am and helps you determine what you're going to suggest in terms of comps questions and so forth. And I look forward to meeting with you. We'll see you soon.